It was an ordinary afternoon when Mia Johnson, a 32-year-old woman, decided to drive across town to meet her friend. Mia had been through a lot in her life. She was a strong, independent woman who had built a name for herself in the community. People knew her as someone who always stood up for what was right, especially when it came to injustice. Her husband, Officer Mark Johnson, was a well-respected member of the local police force. Together, they made a powerful team. But this afternoon would change everything. As Mia drove down the road, enjoying the quiet of the day, she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A police car. She frowned, pulling over to the side of the road. She knew she hadn't been speeding or doing anything wrong. But as the officer approached her car, she felt a strange feeling in her stomach. Something wasn't right. The officer was a man she had never seen before, a tall, broad-shouldered cop with a stern look on his face. His uniform was neat, and his expression cold. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice rough. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Mia felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at the officer, trying to stay calm. "No, officer, I'm not sure," she replied politely. "I haven't been speeding." The officer gave her a quick glance before his eyes narrowed. "Well, you made an illegal turn back there. I saw it." His tone was sharp, and there was no hint of understanding in his voice. Mia frowned. She had followed all the traffic signs carefully and couldn't remember making any illegal turns. But she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded and said, "I'm sorry, officer. I wasn't aware." The officer stepped back for a moment, his eyes scanning her car. He seemed to be looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. After what felt like an eternity, he returned to the window. "I'm going to need to see your license and registration." Mia handed him her papers, still trying to keep her cool. But as she did, something changed in the officer's expression. He looked at her papers, then back at her, and a flash of anger crossed his face. "Is there something wrong, officer?" Mia asked, trying to remain composed. The officer didn't answer. He stared at her for a moment before slapping his hand against the door. "You think you can get away with breaking the law just because you're driving a nice car?" His voice was louder now, more aggressive. Mia was taken aback. She hadn't expected this. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she refused to show fear. "I'm not trying to get away with anything," she said firmly. "I just want to know what the problem is." The officer glared at her, his face turning red. Without warning, he slapped her across the face. Mia gasped in shock. Her cheek burned, and she could feel the sting of the slap deep inside. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The officer had crossed a line. The few people who were nearby stared in disbelief, but no one stepped in. Mia's heart raced, but she kept her composure. Her hand trembled as she touched her cheek, but she didn't say a word. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. She could feel the tension rising in the air, and something told her that this encounter wasn't over. She had no idea just how much it would change her life. Mia sat in her car, still reeling from the officer's slap. Her cheek burned, and the shock of the moment made it hard to think clearly. She didn't know what had just happened. How could someone, especially an officer of the law, treat her like that? As she gathered herself, the officer stood a few feet away, staring at her. His hand rested on his belt, and he looked like he was trying to calm himself down. Mia took a deep breath, holding back tears. She knew she had to stay strong, but her mind raced with confusion. It was a long moment before the officer returned to her car. His voice was now quieter, but there was still an edge to it. "I'm going to let you off with a warning," he said, almost as if he were doing her a favor. But Mia could hear the anger in his tone, and she could feel the fear bubbling up inside her. Without saying another word, the officer handed her back her papers and walked away, leaving Mia in the car, shaking. She wanted to scream, to say something, anything, but she stayed silent. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to drive away slowly. As Mia drove off, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She didn't know why the officer had treated her like that. Had it been something about her? Or was it just the officer's anger that led to the slap? Whatever it was, it didn't make sense, and Mia knew she couldn't just forget about it. When she arrived at her destination, Mia immediately called her husband, Officer Mark Johnson. He answered the phone almost right away. "Hey, honey, what's up?" he asked, his voice warm and friendly. "I need to talk to you about something," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady. She told him what had happened, explaining everything from the traffic stop to the slap. As she spoke, she could hear Mark's tone shift from casual to serious. He asked questions to make sure he understood every detail, and with every word, Mia could feel the weight of the situation growing. "This is unbelievable," Mark said finally. "I'll handle this, Mia. Just stay calm. I'm going to find out who this officer is and make sure he's held accountable." Mia wasn't sure if she felt relieved or scared. On one hand, she was grateful that Mark was going to help her. But on the other hand, she had no idea what the consequences of all this would be. Would it escalate? Would it be the start of something bigger? She didn't know, but she knew she couldn't stay quiet. Meanwhile, word began to spread. The incident was already starting to get attention. People who had seen the traffic stop, and others who had heard about it, began to talk. Some people expressed their anger and disbelief. Others said that they had seen the officer acting aggressively before. The more Mia thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger than one bad officer. Mia's mind kept replaying the moment when the officer slapped her. The sting still lingered on her skin, but the hurt was more than physical. It was the shock, the disbelief, and the humiliation that followed. She didn't know how to explain it, but she couldn't let this go. The next morning, Mark came home early, his face serious. "I found out who the officer is," he said, his voice tight. "And he works under my command." Mia froze. She hadn't known this detail, and it made her feel even more unsettled. The officer who had slapped her wasn't just some random cop. He was part of Mark's team. The next few hours felt like a blur for Mia. She sat quietly at the kitchen table, waiting for Mark to return. Her mind was racing with so many thoughts. The slap, the officer, the fact that he worked under Mark. It all felt like a twisted nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. Mark had left for work early that morning, determined to find out everything he could about the officer who had treated Mia so badly. He was furious. Mia could feel the anger in his voice when he told her he was going to handle it. But now, sitting alone in the house, she began to feel a heavy weight on her chest. What would happen next? How would things change? Hours passed, and then, finally, Mark came home. His face was tired, but his eyes were filled with determination. He walked straight to Mia, sitting down beside her. "I spoke with some of my colleagues. His name is Officer Jacobson, and I found out he's been having issues with his behavior for a while now," Mark said, his voice low and serious. Mia listened carefully, feeling a small sense of relief. She had been worried that the officer's actions might be an isolated incident, but it seemed that this wasn't the first time he had acted aggressively. "What kind of issues?" Maya asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mark leaned back in his chair, looking down for a moment before meeting her eyes. "It's not just his behavior on the job," Mark explained. "Jacobson has been dealing with personal problems, and some of his colleagues have noticed a change in him lately. But no one really knows how far he's willing to go." Mia's heart sank. She had hoped that the officer's anger was just a one-time mistake, but now it seemed that he might be struggling with deeper issues. "Do you think he'll get into trouble for what he did?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Mark replied. "It's hard to say. Jacobson has been with the department for years, and he has a reputation. People have been hesitant to speak out against him. But I won't stand for this, Mia. I'll make sure this is handled properly. No one should get away with hurting you." Mia was grateful for her husband's support, but she couldn't help feeling conflicted. On one hand, she knew Mark had the power to make things right, but on the other hand, she was still scared of what might happen. Jacobson wasn't just any officer. He was someone Mark worked with closely every day. How would this affect their lives? Mark sat beside her, looking concerned. "We're going to take this one step at a time," he said. "I'll talk to the higher-ups and make sure they investigate everything. But you need to know that I'm on your side, Mia. Always." Mia nodded, feeling a mix of relief and fear. The truth was starting to come to light, but she wasn't sure what it would mean for the future. She had no idea how far this would go, or how much it would change her life and Mark's career. She couldn't forget the way Officer Jacobson had treated her. The humiliation, the anger, the fear. But now, knowing that others had noticed his troubling behavior, Mia wondered how long this had been going on. How many others had he hurt before her? The more Mia thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't just let this go. She had to stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone who might be affected by this officer's actions. The following day, Mark had to go into work earlier than usual. The situation with Officer Jacobson was becoming more serious, and Mark knew that time was of the essence. He spent the morning speaking with his superiors, making sure they understood just how serious the incident was with Mia. It wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about making sure something like this didn't happen again. Mia stayed home, feeling a mixture of nerves and determination. She knew Mark was doing everything he could, but she couldn't stop thinking about the moment when Officer Jacobson slapped her. The sting of the slap had faded, but the emotional pain still lingered. She couldn't forget how helpless she had felt in that moment. At the same time, Mia understood the importance of standing up for herself and others. She couldn't let fear control her. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure no one else had to face what she had faced. Later in the afternoon, Mark came home, his face serious. He had been in a meeting with his higher-ups, and he wasn't happy with what he had learned. "Mia, I need you to stay calm," he said as soon as he walked in the door. "Jacobson isn't just any officer. He's been with the department for a long time, and he has a lot of connections." Mia looked at her husband, her heart racing. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice shaky. Mark took a deep breath. "It means that it might take some time for things to move forward. Some people are going to try to protect him, but we're not backing down. I'm going to confront him directly and let him know that this behavior is not acceptable." Mia felt a surge of both fear and pride. She knew Mark had to do what he thought was right, but she couldn't help worrying about the consequences. What would happen if Jacobson refused to back down? What if things got worse? That evening, Mark arranged a meeting with Officer Jacobson. It wasn't going to be easy, but Mark was determined to make sure Mia's voice was heard. He wanted to make it clear that what Jacobson had done was wrong, and that there would be consequences for his actions. Mia stayed home, anxiously waiting for any news. She knew that Mark would give it his all, but she couldn't shake the worry in her chest. She had never seen Mark so focused and serious before, and it made her both proud and nervous. As the hours passed, Mia couldn't sit still. She paced back and forth, trying to distract herself, but her thoughts kept returning to the confrontation Mark was having. What was going on? Was Jacobson going to admit his mistake, or was he going to lie and try to cover everything up? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mark returned home. His face was still serious, but there was a small glint of relief in his eyes. "I spoke to Jacobson," Mark said, his voice steady. "I told him exactly what I thought. He tried to defend his actions, but he knew deep down that what he did was wrong." Mia looked at Mark, her heart pounding. "What happens now?" she asked. Mark sighed and sat down beside her. "It's not over yet, but this is a start. Jacobson has been put on administrative leave while they investigate. There will be more steps to come, but we're moving in the right direction." Mia felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't the end, but it was a step toward justice. She knew there was still a long way to go, but with Mark by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. They were in this together, and they wouldn't back down. The days following Mark's meeting with Officer Jacobson felt like a blur. Mia couldn't focus on anything except the thought of what was happening next. She kept replaying everything in her mind. The moment the officer slapped her, the way she had been treated, and the conversation with Mark about the investigation. Even though Mark had reassured her, she still felt the tension in the air. Every time she saw a police officer, her heart skipped a beat. The feeling of being powerless, of being treated unfairly, still haunted her. It was hard to shake off the fear, but she was trying her best to stay strong. She knew she couldn't let fear control her actions, not when so many people were watching. Mark was working harder than ever. He had spent countless hours meeting with his superiors, trying to ensure that the right steps were being taken. Mia could see the weight of it all on his shoulders. He was determined to see justice done, but he was also frustrated with the slow process. He knew the longer it took, the harder it would be to make sure Jacobson was held accountable. One afternoon, Mark returned home earlier than usual. His face was serious, but there was something different in his eyes. He sat down beside Mia and took her hand. "I've made some decisions," he said, his voice firm. Mia looked at him, feeling a mix of worry and curiosity. "What kind of decisions?" she asked. "I'm going to confront Jacobson again," Mark said. "But this time, I'll be more direct. I'm going to make it clear that this behavior will not be tolerated, not by me, and not by anyone in this department." Mia nodded, knowing this was the next step. But a part of her still felt uneasy. What would happen if Jacobson refused to listen? What if the officer didn't change? "You have to do what's right," Maya said, her voice steady. "I know you're doing everything you can, Mark, but it's hard to trust that things will get better." Mark squeezed her hand, his expression softening. "I know it's not easy, Mia, but this is the right thing to do. I'm not backing down, and neither should you." Later that evening, Mark went back to work for a meeting with his colleagues. Maya stayed home, her mind racing with thoughts of what could happen. She wasn't just worried for herself. She was worried for her husband, for the officer, and for everyone who might be affected by this situation. The confrontation between Mark and Officer Jacobson was set for the following day. Mark had arranged for a private meeting, where he planned to confront Jacobson once more about his actions. Mia had no idea what the outcome would be, but she hoped that, at the very least, Jacobson would understand the gravity of what he had done. The night before the meeting, Mia lay awake in bed, tossing and turning. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the officer's angry face and hear the sound of the slap. It was hard to forget. The next morning, Mark left for the meeting early. Mia tried to distract herself with everyday tasks, but nothing seemed to take her mind off the situation. As the hours passed, the tension in her chest only grew. She wanted to know what was happening, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions. Finally, Mark returned home, looking tired but determined. "I spoke to Jacobson," he said quietly. "It wasn't easy, but he knows now that his actions are unacceptable. The investigation is moving forward, and he's been placed under further scrutiny." Mia felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she knew the fight wasn't over. There was still so much more to be done, and she wasn't sure what would happen next. But for now, at least, she knew that things were starting to change. She couldn't help but feel hopeful that together, they could make a difference. The days after Mark's confrontation with Officer Jacobson were full of uncertainty. Maya felt a strange mix of relief and worry. On one hand, Jacobson was facing an investigation, and that was something. On the other hand, she knew that the road to justice wouldn't be easy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that things could still take a turn for the worse. Mark continued to push for accountability, meeting with his superiors and gathering evidence. He had already made it clear that he wouldn't let the incident go, no matter how powerful Jacobson was or how long he had been with the department. Mark knew that this was bigger than just one officer. It was about making sure something like this wouldn't happen again. Mia stayed strong, but the memories of the officer's slap still lingered in her mind. Every time she thought about it, a wave of anger would rise inside her. She couldn't understand how someone who was supposed to protect the community could treat her so poorly, but she knew that the fight for justice was just beginning. Weeks passed, and the investigation into Jacobson's actions slowly moved forward. Mia heard little updates from Mark, but she could see the stress in his eyes. He was working tirelessly, trying to make sure that the right thing was done. He wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting for the truth. Then, one afternoon, Mark came home with news. His expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I just got off the phone with the higher-ups," he said. "Jacobson has been suspended while they conduct a full investigation into his actions. It's not over yet, but this is a step in the right direction." Mia felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't the final resolution she had hoped for, but it was a clear sign that things were moving in the right direction. She couldn't help but feel proud of her husband for standing up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. But the reality of the situation still weighed heavily on her. She had lived in the shadow of fear for so long, not knowing if she could trust the people who were supposed to protect her. It was a strange feeling to know that the officer who had slapped her was now facing consequences, but it didn't undo the hurt she had felt. Mia understood that justice didn't always come quickly, but it was a step toward healing. As the investigation continued, Maya started to hear whispers from people in the community. Some were supportive, applauding Mark for his courage in confronting Jacobson. Others were skeptical, unsure if the officer would ever face real consequences. But Maya refused to listen to the doubters. She knew that things were changing, even if it was in small steps. Mark continued to work hard, making sure that the investigation stayed on track. He knew that Jacobson's career and future were at stake, but he also knew that the truth mattered more. He had promised Mia that he would do everything in his power to make sure justice was served, and he was determined to keep that promise. Maya felt a quiet strength growing inside her. She had spent so much time worried about what had happened, but now she was beginning to feel hopeful. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about standing up for what was right. She wasn't going to back down, and neither was Mark. Together, they were starting to make a difference. As the days passed, Maya felt the weight of everything slowly begin to lift. She had spent so much time worrying, but now things were starting to move in the right direction. Officer Jacobson was under investigation, and Mark was doing everything he could to make sure the truth came out. Despite the progress, Mia knew the fight was far from over. She couldn't afford to relax until she knew for sure that Jacobson would face the consequences of his actions. The support from the community had been overwhelming. People who had heard about the incident began reaching out to Mia, offering their encouragement. Neighbors, friends, even strangers sent her messages of support, telling her that she was doing the right thing. It was humbling to see so many people standing behind her. Mia couldn't believe how much her world had changed in just a few weeks. She had gone from feeling completely alone to knowing that she wasn't the only one who cared about justice. People were listening, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as Mia was sitting at home with Mark, they received a call from a local news outlet. The reporter on the other end of the line asked if Maya would be willing to share her story with the public. Mia hesitated at first. She wasn't sure if she was ready to go public with everything. But Mark was right there beside her, offering his support. "If you want to speak out, I'll be with you every step of the way," Mark said, his voice steady. "We can make a difference together." After a few moments of thought, Mia agreed. She knew that sharing her story could help others who might be going through the same thing. If her voice could bring attention to the issue of police misconduct and help change things for the better, then it would be worth it. The interview was scheduled for the next day, and Mia spent the evening preparing herself. She thought about the moment when Officer Jacobson had slapped her. She thought about how much it had hurt, not just physically but emotionally. She thought about how far things had come since then, how much had changed in just a short time. The next day, the camera crew arrived at their home, and Mia sat down for the interview. As the lights turned on and the microphone was placed in front of her, Mia took a deep breath. She had never imagined herself speaking in front of a camera, but now it felt like the right thing to do. "I want to tell people that we all deserve to be treated with respect," Mia began. "It doesn't matter who we are or where we come from. No one should be made to feel less than because of the color of their skin or because of their gender. I want to stand up for myself and for anyone else who has ever been treated unfairly." Mia's voice was strong as she spoke. She didn't shy away from the truth, and she knew that her words would have an impact. The interview went smoothly, and by the time it was over, Maya felt a sense of pride in herself. She had done it. She had shared her story with the world, and now there was no turning back. The support she received after the interview was incredible. People from all over the community, and even some from outside the area, reached out to thank her for speaking out. They told her that her bravery had inspired them to take action in their own lives. It was amazing to think that something so painful had led to so much positive change. Maya realized that the journey was far from over, but she was no longer alone in it. The community, Mark, and even strangers were all standing with her. Together, they could create the change they wanted to see. As the weeks went by, things began to change for Officer Jacobson. The investigation into his actions was moving forward, and it was clear that there would be serious consequences. For the first time in a long while, Jacobson had to face the truth of what he had done. The power he once held was now slipping away, and he was forced to confront the reality of his mistakes. At first, Jacobson tried to deny everything. He insisted that he had acted in the heat of the moment, and that Mia had somehow provoked him. But as the evidence against him grew stronger, it became harder to maintain that defense. Witnesses came forward, and the footage from nearby cameras was clear. He had slapped Mia for no reason other than his own frustration. The department made it clear that they would not tolerate such behavior. Jacobson was suspended, and the investigation continued. He had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. For the first time, Jacobson realized that the power he had once used to control others had no place in a system that demanded respect and accountability. But even as he faced the consequences, something inside Jacobson began to change. He started attending counseling sessions to address the anger issues that had caused him to act out. He knew he had a long way to go, but he was determined to make things right. The guilt he felt weighed heavily on him, and he began to understand the full impact of what he had done. Jacobson reached out to Mia, wanting to apologize for his actions. He knew it would be difficult for her to forgive him, but he needed to express his regret. Mark had made it clear that the investigation would continue, and Jacobson's future as an officer was uncertain, but he wanted to take responsibility for his behavior. When he called Mia, she wasn't sure what to expect. She had spent so much time feeling hurt and betrayed by him, but she knew that forgiveness was an important part of healing, not just for him, but for her as well. "I know I can't take back what I did," Jacobson said on the phone, his voice filled with remorse. "But I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I've been going through therapy, and I'm trying to become a better person. I know I can never undo the harm I caused, but I'm working hard to change." Mia listened carefully, trying to take in his words. She didn't know what to say at first. After everything that had happened, it wasn't easy to forgive him. But she also understood that everyone was capable of change, and sometimes people needed to take responsibility for their mistakes in order to grow. "I appreciate you reaching out," Maya said finally. "I'm not sure where things will go from here, but I believe that people can change. I hope you truly do, for your sake and for everyone you interact with." The conversation wasn't easy, but it marked a turning point. Mia had always believed in the power of forgiveness, and while she didn't know what the future would hold, she knew that this moment was an important step toward healing. As Jacobson continued his path of redemption, the community began to see a new side of him. He became involved in programs designed to help other officers manage their emotions and avoid making the same mistakes he had. It wasn't an easy road, but Jacobson was determined to make amends. Meanwhile, Mia and Mark continued their work, pushing for justice and speaking out about the need for accountability in law enforcement. They both knew that change didn't come overnight, but every step they took brought them closer to a more just and fair world. The investigation into Officer Jacobson's actions finally came to an end. After weeks of uncertainty, Mia felt a sense of relief when she learned that Jacobson's future as an officer was uncertain. He had been removed from active duty and placed on probation. The department made it clear that any further misconduct would result in his permanent removal. Maya felt a sense of justice, knowing that the system had held him accountable for his actions. But while the outcome was important, it wasn't just about the punishment. It was about the change that had started to take place. Jacobson's journey wasn't over. He had started therapy, and he was committed to improving himself. Mia couldn't erase the past, but she could see that he was making an effort to be better. Mia had spent so much time feeling powerless, but now she felt stronger than ever. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. The support from her community had been overwhelming, and it gave her the strength to continue speaking out about the need for justice and fairness. Mark stood by her side every step of the way, and together they had faced the challenges head-on. Their love for each other had only grown stronger through the process. Mark had kept his promise to fight for what was right, and Mia had kept her promise to stand up for herself, no matter the cost. The couple had become symbols of resilience and determination in their community. People admired their courage, and many came forward to share their own stories of standing up to injustice. It wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about the larger issue of fairness, accountability, and respect. Mia knew that by sharing her story, she had helped open a conversation that needed to be had. One afternoon, as Mia and Mark sat on the porch, reflecting on everything that had happened, Mark turned to her with a soft smile. "I'm proud of you, Mia," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've been through so much, but you've never backed down. You've inspired me, and so many others, to keep fighting for what's right." Mia smiled back, feeling a wave of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mark. We've been through this together." Their bond had deepened throughout the ordeal, and they both knew that they had made a difference. It wasn't always easy, but they had come out stronger on the other side. They had shown that it was possible to fight for justice, even when it seemed impossible. As the weeks went on, Mia continued to speak out, using her voice to advocate for change. She became involved in community programs aimed at reducing police misconduct and improving relationships between officers and the community. Mia knew that there was still much work to be done, but she was determined to be a part of that change. The road ahead was long, but Mia and Mark were ready for whatever came next. They had learned that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to stand up for what was right. And through it all, they had each other. Together, they knew they could continue to make a difference, one step at a time.